Mazower. Read by Ken Kleban. This book contains 188 pages on 5 sides. If you would like to skip over any remaining announcements or introductory material, place your cassette player in fast forward until a second beep is heard. Stop at that point to hear the table of contents, or at the 4th beep to locate the beginning of the author's introduction. This recording is tone indexed. The beginning of each item in the table of contents will be indicated by a beep audible when your cassette player is in fast forward or rewind. Library of Congress annotation. The author of Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, RC 49031, reassesses the area of southeastern Europe known as the Balkans, explains how centuries of peaceful coexistence between diverse religious and cultural populations exploded into nationalist violence following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. 2000. From the book jacket. Throughout history, the Balkans have been a crossroads, a zone of endless military, cultural, and economic mixing and clashing between Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam, Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Subject to violent shifts of borders, rulers, and belief systems at the hands of the world's great empires, from the Byzantine to the Habsburg and Ottoman, the Balkans are often called Europe's tinderbox and a seething cauldron of ethnic and religious resentments. Much has been made of the Balkans' deeply rooted enmities. The recent destruction of the former Yugoslavia was widely ascribed to millennial hatreds frozen by the Cold War and unleashed with the fall of communism. In this brilliant account, acclaimed historian Mark Mazower argues that such a view is a dangerously unbalanced fantasy. A landmark reassessment, the Balkans rescues the region's history from the various ideological camps that have held it hostage for their own ends, not least the need to justify non-intervention. The heart of the book deals with events from the emergence of the nation-state onward. With searing eloquence, Mazower demonstrates that of all the gifts bequeathed to the region by modernity, the most dubious has been the ideological weapon of romantic nationalism that has been used again and again by the power-hungry as an acid to dissolve the bonds of centuries of peaceful coexistence. The Balkans is a magnificent depiction of a vitally important region, its history, and its prospects. About the author. Mark Mazower is a professor of history at Princeton University and has recently been appointed professor of history at Birkbeck College, London. He is the author of several books, most recently, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century. To Dmitry Gondikas. Acknowledgments. I am deeply grateful to Phil Nord for allowing me to spend 2 years at Princeton, where I have been blessed with an extraordinary group of friends and colleagues. My thanks in particular for their comments, advice, guidance, and criticism in connection with this project to Peter Brown, Marwa El-Shakri, Laura Engelstein, Bill Jordan, Tia Kolbaba, Liz Lundbeck, Arno Mayer, Ken Mills, and Jan Prakash. Molly Green and Heath Lowry patiently introduced me to Ottoman realities. Palomaris Voglis and Dimitris Livanios made many valuable suggestions and criticisms. In London, Peter Mandler gave me advice and assistance. Johanna Weber offered huge encouragement and challenged my prose line by line. My debt to her is beyond words. My thanks too to Nicholas Dirks and Tony Molho for opportunities to try out portions of my argument at Columbia and Brown universities, and to Fergus Bremner for his refreshing and nourishing ideas. I am indebted to the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust for their generous support of my work. Over many years, Dmitry Gondikos has turned the program in Hellenic Studies at Princeton into a major center for research and intellectual exchange. To him, as a token of my long-standing gratitude, admiration, and deep affection, I dedicate this book. Contents. Side 1, Tone 2. Acknowledgements, Side 1, Tone 1. Chronology, Side 1, Tone 3. Introduction, Names, Side 1, Tone 4. 1. The Land and its Inhabitants, Side 1, Tone 5. 2. Before the Nation, Side 2, Tone 1. 3. Eastern Questions, Side 3, Tone 1. 4. Building the Nation-State, Side 4, Tone 1. Epilogue, On Violence, Side 4, Tone 2. Guide to Further Reading, Side 5, Tone 1. Reader's Note. Maps and the 18 pages of reference notes found in the print edition are not included in this recording. Explanatory notes have been retained. End of note. Chronology. Please note that some dates are approximate or speculative. 330, Foundation of Constantinople. 395, Division of the Roman Empire. 6th to 7th century, Slav invasions and settlement. 865, Bulgars accept Christianity. 1071, Battle of Manzikert, Seljuk conquest of Anatolia. 1204, Constantinople sacked in the Fourth Crusade. 1243, Mongols defeat Seljuk Turks. 1352, Ottoman Turks gain Gallipoli. 1402, Edirne, Adrianople, becomes new Ottoman capital. 1453, Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. 1463, Ottoman conquest of Bosnia. 1476, Wallachia becomes vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. 1512, Moldavia becomes vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. 1526, Battle of Mohacs, Ottoman defeat of Hungarians and seizure of Buda. 1572, Ottoman fleet defeated at Battle of Lepanto. 1573, Venetians cede Cyprus to Ottoman Empire. 1669, Ottoman capture of Crete from Venetians. 1683, unsuccessful Ottoman assault on Vienna. 1699, Treaty of Karlovitz. 1711 to 1715, Phanariot princes begin rule in Danubian principalities. 1718, Treaty of Passarowitz. 1736 to 1739, Russo-Austrian-Turkish War. 1768 to 1774, Russo-Turkish War. 1770, Revolt in the Peloponnese. 1774, Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca. 1787 to 1792, Russo-Austrian-Turkish War. 1797, end of the Venetian Republic. 1804, First Serbian Uprising. 1815, Second Serbian Uprising. 1821, Greek War of Independence begins. 1827, Battle of Navarino. 1830, Greek independence. 1839, reform legislation in Ottoman Empire. 1858, unification of Danubian principalities, Romania. 1870, creation of the Exarchate of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. 1877 to 1878, Russo-Turkish War. 1878, Treaty of San Stefano, superseded by Treaty of Berlin, results in autonomy for Bulgaria. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania recognized as independent states. Cyprus occupied by British, and Austria-Hungary occupies Bosnia-Herzegovina. 1893, foundation of internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. 1903, Ilinden Uprising. 1908, Young Turk Revolt, Bosnian annexation crisis. 1912, First Balkan War, Albania recognized as independent state. Its boundaries fixed, 1921. 1913, Second Balkan War. 1914 to 1918, First World War. 1918, Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Yugoslavia, established. 1919 to 1922, Greco-Turkish War in Anatolia. 1923, Treaty of Lausanne between Greece and Turkey and exchange of populations. Italian bombardment of Corfu. 1939, Italian invasion of Albania. 1940, Romania forced to cede territory to USSR, Hungary and Bulgaria. Italian invasion of Greece. 1941, German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. 1941 to 1944, Axis occupation, creation of independent state of Croatia. 1944 to 1945, German withdrawal from the Balkans. 1946 to 1949, Greek Civil War. 1948, Tito-Stalin split. 1967 to 1974, dictatorship in Greece. 1980, Tito dies. 1989, downfall of communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe. 1990 to 1991, fighting in Slovenia and Croatia. 1992 to 1995, war in Bosnia. 1999, war in Kosovo between NATO states and Serbia. Introduction. Names. The reputation, name, and appearance, the usual measure and weight of a thing, what it counts for, originally almost always wrong and arbitrary, all this grows from generation unto generation, merely because people believe in it, until it gradually grows to be part of the thing and turns into its very body. What at first was appearance becomes in the end, almost invariably, the essence, and effective as such. Friedrich Nietzsche. At the end of the 20th century, people spoke as if the Balkans had existed forever. However, 200 years earlier, they had not yet come into being. It was not the Balkans, but Rumeli, that the Ottomans ruled, the formerly Roman lands that they had conquered from Constantinople. The Sultan's educated Christian Orthodox subjects referred to themselves as Romans, Romaioi, or more simply, as Christians. To Westerners, familiar with classical regional terms such as Macedonia, Epirus, Dacia, and Mesha, the term Balkan conveyed little. My expectations were raised, wrote one traveler in 1854, by hearing that we were about to cross a Balkan. But I discovered ere long that this high-sounding title denotes only a ridge which divides the waters, or a mountain pass, without its being a necessary consequence that it offer grand or romantic scenery. Balkan was initially a name applied to the mountain range better known to the classically trained Western traveler as ancient Hemus, passed en route from Central Europe to Constantinople. In the early 19th century, army officers like the Earl of Albemarle explored its little-known slopes. The interior of the Balkan, wrote a Prussian diplomat who crossed it in 1833, has been little explored, and but a few accurate measurements of elevation have been undertaken. Little had changed 20 years later when Giacomo August Jochmus's Notes on a Journey into the Balkan, or Mount Hemus, was read to the Royal Geographical Society. It was across these mountains that the Russian army advanced on Constantinople in 1829, and again in 1877. The crossing of the Balkans, wrote the author of a popular history of the Russo-Turkish War of the latter year, must be reckoned one of the most remarkable achievements of the war. By this time, a handful of geographers had already stretched the word to refer to the entire region, mostly on the erroneous assumption that the Balkan Range ran right across the peninsula of southeastern Europe, much as the Pyrenees demarcated the top of the Iberian. In the 18th century, geographical knowledge of the Turkish domains was very vague. As late as 1802, John Pinkerton noted that recent maps of these regions are still very imperfect. Most scholars, including the Greek authors of the earliest study from the area, used the much commoner term European Turkey, and references to the Balkans remain scarce long into the 19th century. They are, for instance, absent in the writings of the savant Ami Bouet, whose minute exploration of the entire region, La Turquie d'Europe of 1840 set standards of accuracy and detail not matched for generations. Nor before the 1880s were there many references to Balkan peoples either. The world of orthodoxy encompassed Greek and Slav alike, and it took time for ethnographic and political distinctions between the various Orthodox populations to emerge. In 1797, the revolutionary firebrand Rigas Velestinis, inspired by the French Revolution, predicted the downfall of the Sultan and proclaimed the need for a Hellenic republic in which all the peoples of Rumeli, Asia Minor, the archipelago, Moldavia, and Wallachia would be recognized as citizens, despite their different races and religions. In Rigas's vast future republic, Greek was to be the language not only of learning, but also of government. As late as the 1850s, informed commentators were still scoffing at superficial observers who considered the Slavonic races as Greek, because the great majority of them are of the Greek religion. Even the German scholar Karl Ritter proposed calling the whole region south of the Danube the Halbinsel Griechenland, Greek Peninsula. Till quite lately, wrote the British historian E.A. Freeman in 1877, all the Orthodox subjects of the Turk were in most European eyes looked on alike as Greeks. Well, after the unmistakable rise of Slav nationalisms, it was hard to discern what pattern of states and peoples would succeed the Turks. Some commentators imagined a variety of self-governing Christian polities under overall Ottoman suzerainty, while others foresaw the partition of the region between a Greek state and a South Slav federation. Almost none anticipated the process of fragmentation that actually occurred. Even in our days, remarked a French writer in 1864, how often have I heard people ask who the Christian populations of Turkey belong to? Russia? Austria? France? And when some dreamers replied, these populations belong to themselves, what amusement, what pity at such utopianism. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, Turkey in Europe was the favored geographical coin of the day. But by the 1880s, the days of Turkey in Europe were evidently numbered. Successor states, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro, had emerged during the 19th century as contenders to carve up what remained. Between 1878 and 1908, diplomatic conferences whittled away Ottoman territory and subjected what remained to great power oversight. Western travelers, journalists, and propagandists flocked to the region and popularized the new, broader use of the term Balkans. By the time of the outbreak of the First Balkan War in 1912, which ended Ottoman rule in Europe, outside the immediate hinterland of Constantinople, it had become common currency. Purists were annoyed. One German geographer talked crossly of the Southeast European, or as people increasingly say, perpetuating the error of half a century, the Balkan Peninsula. A Bulgarian expert complained about this region being wrongly called the Balkan Peninsula, but the tide was against such pedantry. In less than half a century, largely as a result of sudden military and diplomatic changes, a new geographical concept rooted itself in everyday parlance. By 1917, a standard history of the Eastern question talked about the lands which the geographers of the last generation described as Turkey in Europe, but for which political changes have compelled us to seek a new name. The name generally given to that segment is the Balkan Peninsula, or simply, the Balkans. From the very start, the Balkans was more than a geographical concept. The term, unlike its predecessors, was loaded with negative connotations of violence, savagery, primitivism, to an extent for which it is hard to find a parallel. Why savage Europe? Asked the journalist Harry de Wint in his 1907 book of the same name. Because the term accurately describes the wild and lawless countries between the Adriatic and Black Seas. Attuned to a history of revolt and revenge stretching back almost a century and climaxing after 1900 in the terrorist bombings of the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, the Serbian regicide of 1903, and the widespread massacres carried out by all sides during the Balkan Wars, Europe quickly came to associate the region with violence and bloodshed. A decade of further fighting, ending in 1922, with the Greek defeat by the Turks in Asia Minor, and the forced population exchange of nearly 2 million refugees, did little to alter the picture. True, the Balkan peoples now ruled themselves, as so many Western advocates on their behalf had wished. But what was the result? A panoply of small, unviable, mutually antagonistic, and internally intolerant states. This looked exactly like the Kleinstaaterei that opponents of the unrestricted spread of national states had feared. Liberals found it hard to reconcile their happy ideal of national self-determination with the realities of a fragmented and destabilized world. In the case of new states, such as Germany and Italy, 19th century nationalism had welded together tiny, antiquated statelets into larger and economically more rational units. In the Balkans, the outcome had been the opposite. Between the wars, novelists and film directors turned the region into a stage set for exotic thrillers of corruption, quick killing, and easy crime. For Eric Ambler in The Mask of Demetrios, the Balkans symbolized the moral decay of interwar Europe itself. For the less sophisticated Agatha Christie, in her 1925 The Secret of Chimneys, it provided a home for the villainous Boris Anchukov, who came from one of the Balkan states. Principal rivers, unknown. Principal mountains, also unknown, but fairly numerous. Capital, Ekarist. Population, chiefly brigands. Hobby, assassinating kings and having revolutions. As Rebecca West wrote at the start of her travelogue, Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, violence was indeed all I knew of the Balkans, all I knew of the South Slavs. Jacques Tourneur's 1942 film noir, Cat People, went even further and turned the Balkans, through the troubled persona of the film's Serbian heroine, into the seedbed of an ancient sin that turned humans into lethal sexual predators who threatened to destroy the normal, happy lives of ordinary Americans. In the post-war era, some of these cliches became less powerful. The Balkans disappeared from Western consciousness during the Cold War, and the Iron Curtain ran through southeastern Europe, separating Greece from its communist neighbors. Albania became virtually impenetrable. Tito's Yugoslavia was idolized by American policymakers and by the new left in Europe. The language of international non-alignment and of workers' self-management at home fell on receptive ears abroad. Nicolae Ceausescu's rule in Romania was known more for its pronounced anti-Sovietism in foreign policy than for its extreme repression of its own population. In general, Greece became a marginal part of the West, while the other Balkan states formed the least studied part of communist Eastern Europe. Mass tourism brought millions to the region's beaches and ski slopes, and turned peasant culture into after-dinner entertainment. The picturesque replaced the violent, and the worst problems most tourists anticipated were poor roads and unfamiliar toilets. These were the benefits of the long peace that fell over Europe with the Cold War. To many today, they appear not only distant, but illusory, a hiatus in which the true character of the Balkans was temporarily obscured. Since the collapse of communism, it has become easier to see southeastern Europe again as a single entity, but its well-established derogatory connotations have also re-emerged. Indeed, the fighting precipitated by the breakup of Yugoslavia has probably left these more entrenched in the popular imagination than ever. It is now not only Tito and communism that are blamed for mass violence, but ethnic diversity itself, and long-standing historical cleavages between religions and cultures. It is hard to find people with anything good to say about the region. Harder still to discuss it beyond good or evil. Whether it is possible to take a fresh look at the Balkans without seeing them refracted through the prism of the Balkans we have lived with for so long is the main challenge of this work. If the intellectual history of Western stereotypes of the Balkans were no more than 1 century old, it would be hard to explain the grip they still have on us. But the term, though of relatively recent vintage, rests upon a foundation of other associations that reach more deeply into Western thought. One of these is the tension between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity that was crystallized by the Crusaders' sacking of Byzantine Constantinople in 1204. But more important still is surely the deep rift of incomprehension that lies between the worlds of Christianity and Islam, which for more than a millennium, from the 7th century until at least the end of the 17th, were locked in a complex struggle for territory and minds in Europe. To the first jihad, which swept Muslim culture into an area extending from Spain and much of Africa to the borders of India and China, Christendom responded with the Iberian Reconquista, the recovery of lands in southern Italy, and most important, the Crusades. The holy wars of the Mediterranean may have been ultimately, in the words of Eric Christensen, a sad waste of time, money, and life. But though 2 centuries of struggle against the Saracens failed to regain Jerusalem for Christianity, they contributed enormously to strengthening a tradition of martial intolerance in Christian Europe to heretics, pagans, and above all, to Muslims. While Muslim polities accepted non-Muslims as subjects, non-Muslims were always a majority of the population in the Ottoman Balkans. Christian states expelled Muslims and strictly controlled the settlement of small communities of Jews from medieval times on, and regarded them as a threat. The second Islamic campaign against Christendom was spearheaded by a Central Asian nomadic people, the Turks. Between the 11th and the 17th centuries, Turkic peoples gradually overran and defeated the Byzantine Empire, conquering Christian outposts in the eastern Aegean and round the rim of the Black Sea, eventually pushing up through Hungary to the Germanic heartlands of Central Europe. Twice, Ottoman armies besieged Vienna. Christians interpreted the fall of Constantinople in 1453 as proof of the degeneracy of orthodoxy, the ultimate failure of Byzantium as an imperial system, and a divine punishment for men's sins. As Turkish ships cruised off the coast of Italy, pious Catholics were told to pray for the undoing of Islam. The Ottoman dynasty might have seen itself as the successor to the universal monarchies of Rome and Byzantium, the shadow of God on earth. But to many Christians, like the Elizabethan historian Richard Knowles, it was the latest incarnation of the Islamic peril and the present terror of the world. For all the religious antipathy between Christian and Muslim, 16th century Europeans respected and feared the power, reach, and efficiency of the Turks. The Gran Signore, as the Ottoman Sultan was commonly known, was regarded as perhaps the most powerful ruler in the known world. Renaissance observers described him as the successor to Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors, and drew unfavorable contrasts with the disorganized state of Christian armies. In 1525, Christendom's always shaky united front broke down when Francis I, the King of France and eldest son of the Church, sought an alliance with Suleiman the Great against the Holy Roman Emperor. The sacrilegious union of the Lily and the Crescent was the beginning of a long association between Catholic France and the Turks. The Venetians, too, were impressed by the seemingly boundless territorial and human resources of an imperial machine built for war. Their ambassador, Marco Minio, had already warned in 1521 that the Gran Signore seems to have in his grasp the keys to all Christendom. For Thomas Fuller in 1639, the Sultan's empire was the greatest and best compacted that the sun ever saw. Take sea and land together, and from Buda in the west to Taurus in the east, it stretcheth about 3,000 miles. It lieth in the heart of the world, like a bold champion bidding defiance to all his borderers, commanding the most fruitful countries of Europe, Asia, and Africa. With 2 metropolises, Constantinople and Cairo, which awed visitors by their size, and dwarfed London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Rome, its magnificence overshadowed its squabbling neighbors in Christendom, and its power attracted as well as repelled Europeans. Seeing how many go from us to them, commented Sir Henry Blount on Christian converts to Islam, and how few of theirs to us, it appears of what consequence the prosperity of a cause is to draw men unto it. Gradually, this tone of respect for the Ottoman regime began to disappear. From the second half of the 17th century onward, Even before Montesquieu's writings on the theme appeared, Ottoman rule was increasingly described as a tyranny or a despotism. Earlier allusions to its religious tolerance diminished, and there was a growing emphasis on its lack of legitimacy, its reliance on corruption, extortion, and injustice, and the inevitability of its eventual decline. This shift in sentiment took place at a time when the balance of power between the Turks and their opponents was visibly altering, and it looked as though Ottoman armies were approaching their limits. Christian Europe itself was growing stronger thanks to the growth of trade and empires across the Atlantic, the emergence of mercantile capitalism, and the construction of a new state system after the 30 Years' War. In particular, the rise of Russia and Habsburg Austria as military threats capable of going on the offensive against the Ottomans fundamentally altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. From the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, Ottoman power in Europe waned. Habsburg armies captured Hungary, Croatia, and adjacent areas, which they repopulated with Christian settlers and turned into a military frontier zone. The empire was also becoming weaker internally. Ottoman officials themselves noted the central state's growing loss of control over the provinces. Mourning for the golden age of the 16th century turned into a topos in Ottoman political literature. Life in much of the empire, and certainly in the Balkans, became less secure. Broad shifts in values accompanied these political and economic developments. After the religious wars of the 17th century, the rise of science and the Enlightenment brought a new secularism to Europe that unified elite culture and made the politico-religious structure of the Ottoman Empire seem old-fashioned. From this point on, there emerges a Western condemnation of overweening religious power, applied to corrupt Orthodox prelates as much as to Islamic fanatics, which has lasted into the present. In the writings of travelers, pundits, and philosophers, powerful new polarities emerge between civilized West and barbarous East, between freedom-loving Europe and despotic Orient. Sensual, slow-moving, dreamlike, the latter acted as a mirror to the self-regarding Western visitor. Note, there was also a countercurrent, rather weaker, of pro-Turkish critics of contemporary European society, of whom Montesquieu was among the most prominent. End of note. The Balkans themselves occupied an intermediate cultural zone between Europe and Asia. In Europe, but not of it. 19th century travelers had a far sharper and more value-laden sense than their predecessors that they were leaving Europe for Asia the minute they crossed into Ottoman lands. Standing in 1875 on the banks of the river Sava, the border between Habsburg Croatia and Ottoman Bosnia, the youthful Arthur Evans began to realize in what a new world we were. The Bosniaks themselves speak of the other side of the Sav, spelled S-A-V-E, as Europe, and they are right, for to all intents and purposes, a 5 minutes voyage transports you into Asia. Travelers who have seen the Turkish provinces of Syria, Armenia, or Egypt, when they enter Bosnia, are at once surprised at finding the familiar sights of Asia and Africa reproduced in a province of European Turkey. Westerners noted the insecurity of private property, the mysteries of Ottoman law, and the sharp and all-important distinction between ruling and subject religions. Above all, they were struck by a set of aesthetic, almost theatrical impressions. The unexpected colors, smells, mixtures of peoples. Landing in Preveza, opposite the Ionian Islands in 1812, the young Henry Holland wrote, "Entering these regions, the scene is suddenly shifted, and you have before your eyes a new species of beings, with all those gaudy appendages of Oriental character and scenery which have so long delighted the imagination in the tales of the East." The uniform habits of the Turk, derived from his religion and other circumstances, render this change almost as remarkable in the first Turkish town you may enter, as in those much further removed from the vicinity of the European nations. 1 century later, a young Russian journalist, later to achieve fame as Leon Trotsky, looked out of his carriage window as he traveled by rail from Budapest to Belgrade on the eve of the First Balkan War, and enthused, "The East the East. What a mixture of faces, costumes, ethnic types, and cultural levels. The disconcerting interpenetration of Europe and Asia, West and East, finds its way into most descriptions of the Balkans in modern times. Europe is seen as a civilizing force, a missile embedding itself in the passive matter of the Orient. Travelers routinely comment on signs of European life, such as houses with glass windows, cutlery, cabarets, or hotels with billiard rooms. Balkan cities are usually described as having a European facade behind which hides an Oriental, meaning picturesque, but dirty, smelly, wooden, and unplanned, reality. Railways are European. Cart tracks are not. Technology is definitely European, but not religious observance. The social fabric is almost always divided into a modernizing surface and a traditional substance. Oriental realities, the power of religion, the prevalence of agrarian poverty, are assumed to be phenomena that have not changed for centuries. By the end of the 19th century, as numerous accounts testify, it was virtually impossible for Western travelers, exposed to the heady delights and sensuous Orientalism of writers such as Pierre Loti, not to see the Balkans in this way. Diplomatically, and despite the link with France, the Ottoman Empire was long regarded as lying outside the European concert of powers. It had not been represented at the Congress of Vienna, for instance, in 1815, and was excluded by commentators on international law from the Christian family of nations. Only Realpolitik, produced by the empire's own evident decline, and the worrying rise of Russia brought it in. Having essentially fought the Crimean War to save the Turks from the Russians, the victorious powers in 1856 finally declared, "The Sublime Porte admitted to participate in the advantages of the public law and system of Europe." But in return, the Porte was compelled to introduce reforms with regard to property, justice, and religious equality that the Christian powers insisted were necessary for a modern, civilized state. The Turks themselves were never accepted as Europeans. In the increasingly racialized vocabulary of the 19th century, they were Asiatics, nomads, and barbarians, ruling over the lands where European civilization had its birth. The Turks, wrote Lord John Russell in 1828, appeared to be distinguished from the nations which occupy the rest of Europe in nearly every circumstance. Even for R.G. Latham, among the most level-headed of Victorian ethnographers, the Turk is European as the New Englander is American. That is, not strictly. While Latham poured scorn on the idea that the Turks were newcomers to Europe, or Asiatic in any meaningful sense, he felt their religion made them impracticable members of the European system. Muslims were widely regarded as more prone to acts of barbarism than their Christian subjects. No war, ancient or modern, wrote an American diplomat in 1842, was ever carried on with such unrelenting fury and such cruelty as the war against the Greeks by the Turks. It is a matter of astonishment that the Christian nations of Europe could have so long remained silent spectators of its atrocities. Despite the writings of men like George Finlay, whose history of the Greek War of Independence pulled no punches in describing a mutual war of extermination, in the popular imagination the violence ran only one way. This one-sided outrage was harnessed effectively by Gladstone in his denunciations of the Bulgarian horrors. It proved on the whole impervious to any evidence that Christians too committed atrocities, or on occasions deliberately provoked them. When a Moslem kills a Moslem, it does not count, was how Edith Durham summed up Western attitudes. When a Christian kills a Moslem, it is a righteous act. When a Christian kills a Christian, it is an error of judgment, better not talked about. It is only when a Muslim kills a Christian that we arrive at a full-blown atrocity. Christian Europe's blindness to Muslim victims overlooked the huge movements of populations triggered off by Ottoman decline. People often talk in the West about transporting all the Turks, in other words, Muslims, to Asia, in order to turn Turkey and Europe into a uniquely Christian empire. Ami Bouet had written in 1854. This would be a decree as inhumane as the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, or of Protestants from France, and indeed scarcely feasible, since the Europeans always forget that in Turkey, in Europe, the Muslims are mostly Slavs or Albanians, whose right to the land is as ancient as that of their Christian compatriots. Yet according to one estimate, nearly 5 million Muslims were driven from former Ottoman lands in the Balkans and the Black Sea region in the century after 1821. From the Balkans themselves, between 1.7 and 2 million Muslims immigrated voluntarily or involuntarily between 1878 and 1913 to what would later become the Republic of Turkey. The Turkish language declined as a regional lingua franca. Urban settlements were taken over by Christian incomers, and Ottoman buildings were deliberately demolished or left to rot. The dynamiting of mosques and other architectural masterpieces in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the early 1990s was thus the continuation in an extreme form of a process of de-Islamicization that had begun decades earlier. When the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans collapsed in 1912 to 1913, many in the West saw this as the final expulsion of Asian power from Europe and the triumph of the religious and racial vigor of Christendom. According to the American journalist Frederick Moore in the National Geographic, the Asiatic Turks had blighted their European subjects by imposing Islamic rule upon them. They had tried to invigorate their own racial stock through conversion, but had ultimately been unable to prevail over the biologically superior European breeds they ruled. Now the Turk will make his way back to Asia as he came, centuries ago, little changed by his association with the peoples of Europe, whom he has kept as he found them in a medieval condition, with all the barbarity of medieval Europe, with all its picturesqueness, its color, squalor, and unthinking faith. As for the future, Moore predicted little change among the empire's former rulers, since the Turk is a Muslim, and the soul of the true Muslim is indifferent to progress. But for the enlarged Balkan states, it seems safe to predict rapid development along modern lines. For we have seen how all of them, under great difficulties, have already the nations their pastime. In similar fashion, the liberal optimism of 1912 was quickly and even more rudely to be dashed. The victorious Balkan states, fresh from beating the Ottoman army, immediately turned on one another in the Second Balkan War. News emerged of the brutality waged by their regular armies against civilians, especially in Macedonia, Kosovo, and the borders of Montenegro. "That's how all this looks when you see it close up," reported Trotsky. "Meat is rotting, human flesh as well as the flesh of oxen. Villages have become pillars of fire. Men are exterminating persons not under 12 years of age. Everyone is being brutalized, losing their human aspect." Above all, in June 1914, came the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian nationalist student Gavrilo Princip. The Second Bosnian Crisis and the Third Balkan War of the 20th century turned into the continental bloodbath that finally destroyed Europe's old order. For this, if nothing else, the Balkans were henceforth cursed in the European consciousness. Only those most committed to one or other of these small nations continued to argue that they were worth supporting. Even fewer bothered to argue that they should not be loaded down with the cultural assumptions of the West, but understood on their own terms. A truer and less jaundiced understanding of the Balkans requires us to try to unravel the ways in which attitudes to the region have been shaped, not only by events that took place there, but by more sweeping narratives of the development of European identity and civilization. The basic historiographical challenge is how to fit the centuries of Ottoman rule into the story of the continent as a whole. For many eminent scholars of Europe, the answer has been obvious. Sir John Marriott begins his sober history of the Eastern question with the stark assertion that the primary and most essential factor in the problem is the presence, embedded in the living flesh of Europe, of an alien substance. That substance is the Ottoman Turk. Ottoman rule, in other words, sundered the Balkans from the rest of the continent and ushered in a new dark ages for the region. Since, in the words of Polish historian Oskar Halecki, throughout the whole course of European history, in its proper sense, Europe was practically identical with Christendom. The fact that before the Turks, the region formed part of the only marginally less despised Byzantine Empire simply reinforced this way of looking at the problem. Not everyone buys this straightforward equation of Europe with Catholic Christianity. Arnold Toynbee and Nicolae Iorga, the eminent Romanian historian, have both argued, following, after all, the claims of Mehmet the Conqueror himself, that it was actually the Ottoman Empire which was the successor to the universal state of Byzantine Orthodoxy. Iorga in particular suggested that there had been a Byzantium after Byzantium, surviving under the rule of the sultans. But this assertion of the affinities that might bind Christianity and Islam has largely fallen on deaf ears. Many more scholars, and probably the mass of popular opinion, have followed Halecki, who insists that, from the European point of view, it must be observed that the Ottoman Empire, completely alien to its European subjects in origin, tradition, and religion, far from integrating them in a new type of culture, brought them nothing but a degrading foreign dominance, which interrupted for approximately 400 years their participation in European history. Following this logic, successor states in the Balkans look back to the medieval or classical past for their national roots, and encourage their historians to pass over the period of Ottoman rule as quickly as possible, as though nothing good can have come out of those years. When at the end of the 14th century, Bulgaria fell under Ottoman domination, asserted Todor Zhivkov in 1981, the natural course of her historical development was stopped and reversed. Such a view predated Zhivkov's communist regime and survives it too. The Serbian legend of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 reflects the same obsession with the question of legacy. Greek historians and preservationists are much more likely to work on ancient Byzantine or modern history than on the Ottoman period. Historians of Britain do not, on the whole, spend much time wondering how much their country owes to its Anglo-Saxon, Norman, or Hanoverian heritage. But questions of continuity, rupture, and historical legacy are inescapable in the Balkans, since what Halecki calls the European point of view has shaped many of the preoccupations of scholars and popular opinion in the region itself. And this is not because people there have some peculiar propensity to lose themselves in the mists of time, but rather because to be European has meant nothing less than denying the legitimacy of the Ottoman past. Reconstructing a respectable record of nationalist struggle and resistance against imperial oppression became necessary for membership of the European Club. Nationalist passions and anxieties are, in other words, expressions of the effort to produce the kind of historical pedigree once, if not still, required by Europe itself. Because the Balkans have had a bad press for so long in Europe, it has been hard for some scholars to resist bringing out the region's virtues. National histories, until very recently, presented the past as the inevitable and entirely deserved triumph of the nation over its enemies. More recently, a disillusionment with nationalism has bred nostalgia for the days of empire. A new trend in Ottoman historiography emphasizes ethnic and religious coexistence under the sultans, and turns the empire into a kind of multicultural paradise avant la lettre. But the glossy version of Ottoman rule is not much of an improvement on the old negativity, except as a corrective to it. The truth is that while for many centuries religious coexistence was undoubtedly more accepted under the Ottomans than almost anywhere in Christendom, there was certainly no sense of religious equality. If there was no ethnic conflict, it was not because of tolerance, but because there was no concept of nationality among the Sultan's subjects, and because Christianity stressed the community of believers rather than ethnic solidarity. Normative history sets up one pattern of historical evolution as standard, and then explains deviations from that. The 19th century mind took it for granted that history worked in this way, and that what one was describing was the success or failure of any given society in climbing the path of progress from backwardness and barbarism to civilization. In preferring to talk about the path from tradition to modernity, 20th century scholars have changed the terms, but retain much of the same linear view. They have drawn on supposedly universal models of economic development and political democratization in order to understand why Balkan states and societies have remained poor and unstable, and have not turned out as they should have done. But it is questionable whether relative poverty in southeastern Europe, or indeed the politics of ethnic violence, can really be explained as marks of backwardness. Since the ethnic mix of the Balkans has remained remarkably unchanged for centuries, during most of which there was no ethnic conflict at all, why is it only in the last 1 or 2 centuries that the cocktail became politically volatile? Contemporary contingencies of mass politics and urban industrial life, the rise of new state structures, and the spread of literacy and technology may well turn out to be as important in the Balkans as the supposed eternal verities of religious fracture, peasant rootedness, and ethnic cleavage. We might find then that the story we tell does not so much affirm as undermine any sense of European superiority. For just as Europe gave the Balkans the categories with which its peoples defined themselves, so it gave them also the ideological weapons, in the shape primarily of modern romantic nationalism, with which to destroy themselves. Trying to understand the Balkans, in other words, challenges us to look at history itself as something more than a mirror which we hold up, blocking out the past to reflect our own virtues. 1. The land and its inhabitants. Mountains come first. Fernand Braudel. Over millions of years, the play of the Earth's tectonic plates pushed up a series of mountain ranges in the Mediterranean, along the geological frontier between Europe and Africa. Stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the ranges of southeastern Europe in the east, they eventually link up with the mountain chains of Asia Minor and Central Asia. To their north, the great Eurasian lowlands extend with scarcely a break from Calais to the Urals. There rainfall is abundant, arable land is plentiful, and numerous navigable rivers connect the interior with the sea. To the south, it is a different story. Good farming land becomes scarcer, the ground is more broken, and rainfall less frequent. Unlike the mountain chains guarding the necks of the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, the Balkan ranges offer no barrier against invasion, leaving the region open to easy access and attack from north and east. On the other hand, their irregular formation hinders movement between one valley and the next. Communication is often easier with areas outside the peninsula than between its component parts, so that Dubrovnik, for instance, has had closer ties for much of its history with Venice than with Belgrade. In this way, mountains have made commerce within the region more expensive and complicated the process of political unification. The effect of mountains is felt everywhere from the skies to the sea. Rain shadows deprive much of the peninsula of the moisture found in Europe's continental climatic zone. Korlashin in Montenegro has an average annual rainfall of 104 inches, while a little way east, Skopje in Macedonia has only 18 inches per year. A tiny coastal strip running down the Dalmatian coast to western Greece enjoys sufficient rain to soften the impact of the harsh Mediterranean summers. On Corfu, the vegetation is luxuriant. The Cyclades, by contrast, are parched and dry. The former is able to support itself. The latter, as wartime starvation revealed, relies on food imports to keep going. In general, the annual precipitation east of the mountains is at least 10 to 20 inches less than farther west, leading to recurrent droughts even in the fertile plains. A dreary, arid, sandy level was how the Vardar Valley presented itself to an intrepid Englishwoman crossing it in the mid-19th century. For many miles, the country is entirely without trees. In the Mediterranean climatic zone, watercourses dry up during the summer, leaving rocky beds and canyons. The result is parched, broken upland, with scarce water supplies, a harsh environment for human habitation that is suited chiefly to abstemious plants. A curious feature in the mountains began itself painfully felt. noted Arthur Evans in 1875, walking across the Herzegovinian karst. There was no water. He describes a prospect of desolation. In every direction rose low mountains, mere heaps of disintegrated limestone rock, bare of vegetation, aptly compared to a petrified glacier or a moonscape. Where summer rain permits, mountain forests and woodland, with beeches, oaks, and sweet chestnuts, testify to perennial supplies of running water. Even so, the peninsula suffers drought more than anywhere else in Europe, except southern Spain and Malta, and deaths caused by water scarcity were reported from Montenegro as late as 1917. Not everywhere in the Balkans is as dry as this. In the Rhodope Mountains, rivers flow throughout the year. The Albanian uplands remind travelers of alpine meadows. Farther east, large parts of former Yugoslavia, Romania, and northern Bulgaria enjoy something closer to a Central European weather pattern. Long, cool winters and heavy rains nourish the impenetrable Šumadija, which once covered much of lowland Serbia in dense oak forest. Endless and endless, now on either side, the tall oaks closed over us, wrote Alexander Kinglake in Eothen, describing a ride toward Constantinople in 1834. Through this our road was to last for more than 100 miles. To the east, the Danube estuary shares climatic features with the southern steppes and the Black Sea, though it suffers from a lack of rainfall where the rain shadow of the Carpathians makes itself felt. Mountains make the contrast between Mediterranean and these northern and eastern weather zones a sudden one. As anyone who has climbed the road from Kotor, on the Dalmatian coast, to the old Montenegrin capital, Cetinje, will know. The climate had suddenly changed, wrote a traveler after having traversed the Balkan mountains in Ottoman Bulgaria. A warmer air surrounded us. The whole of European Turkey, from the southern declivities of the Hemus, lies in a delightful climate, which can display all the charms of the tropics as well as the vigor of the higher latitudes, without suffering their disagreeable effects. For this sun-deprived northerner, not even the plague was enough to overshadow his sense of warmth and well-being as he came closer to the Mediterranean. Rivers are generally crucial for prosperity because until modern times, transportation was easier and cheaper by water. This book contains up to 4 sides per cassette. Side 1, RC 51846, The Balkans, A Short History, by Mark Mazower. Copyright 2000, by Mark Mazower. Read by Ken Kleben. This book contains 188 pages on 5 sides. If you would like to skip over any remaining announcements or introductory material, place your cassette player in fast forward until a second beep is heard. Stop at that point to hear the table of contents, or at the 4th beep to locate the beginning of the author's introduction. This recording is tone indexed. The beginning of each item in the table of contents will be indicated by a beep audible when your cassette player is in fast forward or rewind. Library of Congress annotation. The author of Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, RC 49031, reassesses the area of southeastern Europe known as the Balkans, explains how centuries of peaceful coexistence between diverse religious and cultural populations exploded into nationalist violence following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. 2000. From the book jacket. Throughout history, the Balkans have been a crossroads, a zone of endless military, cultural, and economic mixing and clashing between Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam, Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Subject to violent shifts of borders, rulers, and belief systems at the hands of the world's great empires, from the Byzantine to the Habsburg and Ottoman, the Balkans are often called Europe's tinderbox and a seething cauldron of ethnic and religious resentments. Much has been made of the Balkans' deeply rooted enmities. The recent destruction of the former Yugoslavia was widely ascribed to millennial hatreds frozen by the Cold War and unleashed with the fall of communism. In this brilliant account, acclaimed historian Mark Mazower argues that such a view is a dangerously unbalanced fantasy. A landmark reassessment, the Balkans rescues the region's history from the various ideological camps that have held it hostage for their own ends, not least the need to justify non-intervention. The heart of the book deals with events from the emergence of the nation-state onward. With searing eloquence, Mazower demonstrates that of all the gifts bequeathed to the region by modernity, the most dubious has been the ideological weapon of romantic nationalism that has been used again and again by the power-hungry as an acid to dissolve the bonds of centuries of peaceful coexistence. The Balkans is a magnificent depiction of a vitally important region, its history, and its prospects. About the author. Mark Mazower is a professor of history at Princeton University and has recently been appointed professor of history at Birkbeck College, London. He is the author of several books, most recently, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century. Side 2, The Balkans, by Mark Mazower, continuing on page 18. In the classical Ottoman model, the central state, through its courts and bureaucracy, monitored and regulated relations between peasant and master. Unable easily to pass on their possessions to their heirs, the new estate holders never formed an aristocratic class, capable of threatening the power of the ruling dynasty. They oppressed their peasant farmers, but never owned them. What they owned was the right to their produce. Moreover, they were registered by the state as ruthlessly and effectively as their peasants were. Overall tax burdens on farmers were probably no higher than before the Ottomans came, and the peasants themselves enjoyed more control over their lives than their counterparts in most of Europe. The almost endless wars that had ravaged parts of the Balkans in the 14th century were replaced by the stability brought by an organized imperial state, pursuing a deliberate policy of repopulation. In the first century after the conquest, there was an increase in the area under cultivation. The spread of what we might call politically sensitive crops, such as oranges, tomatoes, mulberries, and later cotton and apricots, all of which require investment in expensive irrigation systems, is one indicator of stability on the land. So too is the rapid growth in the population of Constantinople and other smaller cities, which depended on a healthy agricultural economy for its sustenance. After 2 to 3 centuries of Ottoman rule, however, the empire began to confront new difficulties, facing tougher military opposition as it expanded and finding it harder and harder to raise the tax revenues to pay for incessant wars. Compared with other European powers, France, Spain, even Venice, Ottoman methods of tax farming hindered rather than promoted expansion. Western European economies moved in the direction of new commercial banking, colonial trade, the promotion of private property, and manufacturing growth. Some provincial elites in the Ottoman Empire did also emerge as private entrepreneurs, but the old economy continued to regulate the trade and production of most major commodities and discouraged private investment. To this stuttering leviathan, the Balkans were indispensable, since they provided roughly 2/3 of the tax revenues of the entire empire. The bulk of these was paid by the peasantry. In the writings of an 18th century Ottoman official, Sarı Mehmet Pasha, we see the bureaucracy's traditional argument for treating the peasants well and keeping an eye on the provincial beys. Let them neither oppress the poor rayas, peasants, he states, nor cause them to be vexed by the demand for new impositions in addition to the well-known yearly taxes, which they are accustomed to give. All the experienced sages have likened the taking for inessential expenditures of more money than they can endure from the rayas to taking from the foundation of a building and transferring it to the roof. Such being the case, the poor peasants should not be troubled by any sort of evil innovation. Yet on the land, a major innovation was taking place. A new provincial elite, mostly Muslim, but including some Christian notables, was emerging, which owned villages and fields and passed these possessions on to the next generation. The older Ottoman land regime was passing away and being replaced by one in which privately owned estates encroached on former common lands and dispossessed the peasants. The causes of the rise of these chiflik estates, their nature and extent, is among the most bitterly contested issues in Ottoman historiography. Whether these estates were a response, as was once thought, to growing commercial opportunities in the international economy, or as now seems more likely, to the growing political power of a more exploitative class of tax farming landlords, the outcome was a deterioration in the condition of the peasantry. Balkan peasants, however, were still more fortunate than the enserfed farmhands of the Central and East European flatlands. Many villages preserved their autonomy under the leadership of local notables, who collected the taxes and had their own interest in keeping the peasants' fiscal burden bearable. For if it became too oppressive, the peasants fled in growing numbers from the plains to towns, to lands outside the region, and above all, to the hills. Entire villages were abandoned once those who had initially chosen to remain realized they were still liable for the taxes of those who had already departed. At the same time, the introduction and rapid spread of corn cultivation had, in J.R. McNeill's words, a revolutionary effect on the mountains, as it allowed upland villages to support more people than in the past. Family and clan farming guaranteed the necessary hands for clearing woodland and tilling small upland plots. Females cost dowries to marry off, but were reckoned to be able to carry half the load of a donkey, and provided cheap pack labor. Their bodies often reflected their arduous social position. Women are early worn out, Edith Durham noted. Especially in Montenegro, there is a very great difference in height between men and women. Women, I found, were usually shorter than I am, 5 foot 3 inches, whereas men well over 6 foot are not uncommon. Safe from pirates, malaria, plagues, tax collectors, and marauding militias, hill people were able to negotiate more advantageous tax terms with the imperial government. In remote regions, such as the Agrafa, that is, the unregistered lands, the Albanian uplands in Montenegro, autonomous, indeed virtually free, peasant communities were able more or less to disregard their nominal masters. They pay an annual tribute, wrote Dmitry Kantemir, of the Moldavian mountain Republic near Suceava in the early 18th century. If the prince decides to beat them harshly, they do not spend time in negotiating, but refuse the tribute altogether and retire to the more inaccessible parts of the mountains. For this reason, the prince has never asked them for more than their due. Other villages won tax exemptions by agreeing to serve as pass defenders against brigands, guaranteeing security of passage. In August 1715, after a successful summer campaign against the Venetians in the Peloponnese, the Grand Vizier Ali Pasha negotiated over this issue with a delegation of Greeks from the mountainous Mani Peninsula, whose villages form a kind of republic, according to the campaign's chronicler. Yet political autonomy came at the price of a constant struggle to make a living. In the 19th century, mountain communities started for the first time to face overpopulation. Their basic diet was healthy, and on average, people grew taller than in the plains. But the parched mountains did not generate enough food to last the year round. At Metsovo, the local harvest was reckoned to be good for barely 1 or 2 months, forcing their inhabitants to find other supplementary livelihoods. Forests provided berries and mushrooms for picking, another skill now dying out, charcoal and timber for sale. Hill villagers also sold snow to the lowlands. As late as the 1920s, before the advent of mass refrigeration, snow was being sold in Yanina, and was still profitable despite a 65% meltage rate. They needed something to sell in order to buy the salt from the lowlands that alone made life possible in these food deficit communities. Brigandage offered a more heroic way of making money. The typical mid-19th century bandit, according to the author of an illuminating study of the phenomenon, was a young mountaineer, between 20 and 30 years old or younger, and more often than not, a migratory shepherd. Pushed outside the law, often by his own violent actions, the brigand's primary purpose was usually to secure an amnesty, and if possible, an official appointment in the service of the state as local watchman. In the meantime, he talked tough and tried to make himself as intimidating as possible. Your coffee is ours, your money is ours, and your blood is ours, one Albanian brigand reminded his British captive. Everyone is in debt to the robber. I am Sultan here. I am King of England here. Robbers and sheep stealers were a growing problem in the 18th and 19th centuries. As the Ottoman Empire shrank and disintegrated, frontiers proliferated across which brigands could roam, fleeing pursuers and often enjoying political protection in neighboring states as self-proclaimed patriots. In reality, they were as likely to prey on poor Christian farmers as on Muslims, often taking the self-serving and self-righteous line that Christians who remained under Turkish rule were no better than Turks themselves. Great alarm prevailed in all directions respecting the robbers, noted the intrepid David Urquhart, traveling to Mount Athos in the 1830s. They had been guilty of fearful atrocities and had, by attacking on several occasions the peasantry, aroused the feelings of the people against them. These brigands were neither social bandits, robbing the rich to aid the poor, nor national heroes. Rather, they were a symptom of high-altitude poverty, and one way of trying to ameliorate it. Their sense of honor was highly developed. Raiding sheep or cattle was considered a more heroic pursuit than conventional and sedentary ways of earning a living. Yet the brigand's lot, stripped of the mystique, was a miserable one. The Greek chief of the band that seized Urquhart tried to excuse himself to his captive. Look at those men. Some of them barefoot, with clothes of string rather than cloth, with empty tobacco bags and empty stomachs. What makes them lead such a life? And what restraint can you place on men who live so, driven like oxen in the fields, or hunted like bears in the mountains? Alongside the brigands, putting up with them, suffering from them, and sometimes joining them, were the shepherds whose way of life had profited most from the collapse of settled farming in the plains. Between the 17th and the early 20th centuries was the golden age of the pastoral economy in the Balkans. Military men, according to a 1609 document from Rumelia, were taking over abandoned holdings, settling slaves on them, and converting the properties to livestock grazing. With their huge flocks of sheep, the shepherds wintered in the valleys on St. Demetrios' Day, November 8th, and moved camp again on St. George's Day, May 6th, to spend the summers on mountain pasture, often traveling hundreds of miles in the process. The fact that their taxes had to be paid in cash made shepherds familiar with the demands of a money economy. They sold their livestock, sheepskins, woolen goods, and cheeses in village markets or at the great annual fairs that were the motors of Balkan commerce until the early 20th century. Gradually, some settled as merchants. A small hill town like Mazower, high in the Pindos, was in fact surprisingly wealthy by the middle of the 19th century, thanks to the business ventures of these men. Occasionally, hill settlements enjoyed the right mix of seclusion, water, and raw materials to permit what economic historians call proto-industrialization. The villages which are least favored in respect of soil, wrote Leake, have resources in the manufacture of cotton and wool. It is reckoned that 1/3 of the inhabitants of Agrafah gain a living by weaving. There are also many workers in gold and silver, and skatina is a fabric of swords blades, gun barrels, and locks of pistols. Textile production in small factories in Greek and especially Bulgarian upland settlements spread in the decades before these regions won independence. But by the early 19th century, competition from Western imports was hitting them hard, and previously prosperous mountain manufacturers such as Ambilakia fell on hard times. Thereafter, such activities, where they survived, descended to the towns and cities. The coming of Ottoman rule had perhaps a greater impact upon the town dweller than on the peasant. Where a town surrendered without a fight during the period of conquest, the port usually refrained from sacking it. Nevertheless, many Byzantine towns from the capital downward were ruined and devastated by the conquerors. But the Ottomans knew that towns were vital for the administration of the empire. For Mehmed the Conqueror, their renewal was the mightiest war, compared with which military victory had been merely the lesser war. The Ottomans quickly repopulated major urban centers like Constantinople through the forced resettlement of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. For similar reasons, Sultan Bayezid II welcomed Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain, Portugal, and southern Italy in the late 15th century. and prominent Sephardic communities took root in the towns of the empire. By the end of the 15th century, the Porte had made a determined effort to revivify urban life. High court officials were encouraged to finance complexes of public buildings, caravanserais, covered markets, public baths, mosques and schools, hospitals, aqueducts, in order to provide the services required by an urban population. Many former Byzantine cities, notably the capital, recovered their strength, while a number of new settlements emerged, including Bosna Serai, Sarajevo, Banja Luka, and Mostar in Bosnia, Tirana, the future capital of Albania, and smaller towns such as Elbasan and Janica. The population of these towns was often overwhelmingly Muslim, while the countryside remained largely Christian. According to the tax registers of 1520 to 1530, more than 80% of the inhabitants of the Balkans were Christians. Yet Muslims outnumbered Christians in most major Balkan urban settlements. Historians are divided as to whether the overall impact of Ottoman rule marked a disjuncture or a continuation of city life. One thing is clear, however. There was no overall decline. It was only under the sultans that walled fortresses such as Belgrade developed into larger commercial and administrative centers with extensive suburbs. Major urban projects, such as large mosques, were completed rapidly by European standards, testifying to the empire's ability to mobilize labor effectively, even in small market towns such as Saras and Prizren. Overall, the degree of urbanization in the Balkans increased in the early phases of Ottoman rule, and coastal trading cities such as Salonika and Dubrovnik, effectively an Ottoman vassal, prospered. By 1600, Constantinople was the largest city in Europe. Even if we accept a low estimate of 250,000 inhabitants, it still overshadowed London, 200,000, Paris, 220,000, and Rome, 105,000. Berlin, 25,000, Madrid and Vienna, both 50,000, were unremarkable towns of the middling rank. Cairo, on the other hand, was bigger even than the imperial capital, the most admirable and greatest city seen upon the earth, according to William Lithgow, who could compare it with most of its rivals. As for Edirne, the occasional seat of the Ottoman court, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who visited it in 1717 and was not overly impressed, nonetheless admitted to 365 shops furnished with all sorts of rich goods, exposed to sale in the same manner as at the New Exchange in London. But the pavements kept much neater, and the shops all so clean they seemed just new painted. Idle people of all sorts walk here for their diversion or amuse themselves with drinking coffee or sherbet. These were staples of Ottoman urban life before they were implanted into the cities of Western Europe. Towns were favored precisely because they were indispensable to the government of the empire. They were centers of administration from which the state could collect taxes, supervise trade, and extract its monopoly of vital commodities, such as salt. They existed in the shadow of Constantinople, which they fed through the food purchase quotas and elaborate provisioning system that lay at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Even after the central Ottoman state weakened in the course of the 17th century, the barriers to private capital accumulation on the West European model remained high. Trade, and hence capital, was gradually passing from Muslims and Jews into the hands of Christian Orthodox merchants, who did constitute an incipient bourgeoisie of sorts. But the latter were well aware of their vulnerability in the empire, and made sure that affiliates existed beyond its reach, in Vienna, Odessa, or Marseille, whither funds could be safely transferred. The cities themselves remained chiefly centers of commerce and handicrafts. They were also acutely prone to plague, suffering from what T. Stoyanovich calls exceptional pestilences, on an average of once every dozen years throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And because the slow movement of the brick-stone frontier from northern to southeast Europe meant that houses were still mostly built of wood, fires devastated towns as late as the early 20th century. By the early 19th century, it was the silence of Turkish towns that struck the Western visitor. The lack of church bells, the absence of wheeled vehicles and horseshoes, all of which testified to the lack of blacksmiths, metalworkers, and machinery. Amid the novelties that strike the European on his arrival, wrote William Turner in 1812, "Nothing surprises him more than the silence that pervades so large a capital. If no real industrialization took place in towns under Ottoman rule, it was for the same reasons that commercial agriculture also made little progress in the empire. The lack of well-kept, well-secured roads, bureaucratic obstruction, religious objections to the spread of printed media and scientific knowledge, and levels of public disorder that, if anything, probably increased over time as the political struggle for Macedonia intensified. Lack of security for the rural population was a long-standing problem. All the territory of the Grand Signor is dispeopled for want of justice, or rather, by violent oppressions," Sir Thomas Roe had noted in 1622. But the problem did not disappear. Romania in the 1840s had estates of monstrous size, almost completely devoid of inhabitants. Having heard from Greeks in one lowland village how they were abused by the Turkish authorities, one British visitor understood better the rudimentary security system they had adopted. "We found the dogs very troublesome," wrote Captain J.J. Best in 1842. "No wonder they keep such fierce dogs when the inhabitants are liable to such treatment." But dogs were little use against the tax collector. "The first act of a Greek bishop," wrote a local observer, "after his arrival at his post, is plunder. Tax farmers and moneylenders exploited the peasants' vulnerability to fluctuations in the harvest and their helplessness in the face of armed force. The Wallachian is idle," wrote an observer of the Romanian lands, "because he knows he could not enjoy the fruits of industry, since they would be extorted from him under the name of tithes." The ensuing depopulation led to the abandonment of land, extensive farming, and the use of arable land for pasture. Deforestation, a consequence of population strain up in the hills, accelerated soil erosion, the silting up of alluvial valleys, and the spread of malaria. This depressing picture did not apply everywhere. To be sure, in the valley of the Morava, there were rich crops of Indian corn, under good cultivation, and a smooth expanse of fertile fields. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the large landowners who had begun to amass land included a few improving provincial rulers and notables. Ali Pasha of Yanina introduced silkworms, mulberries, and rice cultivation into his domains. Before he was toppled by the Sultan, he proceeded with the greatest severity against the large bands of robbers who had infested his lands, and by opening the country to merchants and securing their persons and goods, has not only increased his own revenues, but bettered the condition of his subjects. The Bushotlis, another Albanian notable family of the 18th century, cultivated rice and cotton in their domains, which they exported to Italy. Around Saris as well, cotton cultivation spread very fast. Some reforming Ottoman civil servants also sought to modernize the countryside and the towns. Midhat Pasha, who was probably the greatest Ottoman civil servant of the 19th century, and was called Jawar Pasha by the Turks for his supposed partiality to the Christians, increased tax revenues and boosted agricultural production in Danubian Bulgaria. But Midhat Pasha did not last long, falling victim to the political insecurity that soon undid his work. If the Ottoman lands never felt the full impact of improving landowners of the kind found in Western and Central Europe, they could not escape the growing impact of Western capitalism, especially as trade linked the empire with markets in Central Europe, France, and farther afield. As the crisis of government deepened, the need for urgent reforms, intermittently tried since the early 18th century, became obvious to the Porte. For nearly a century, the power of the Sultan's household had been undermined by its inability to control the Janissary Corps, the court militia that had once been an integral part of the Ottoman machinery of conquest. Over time, the Janissaries evolved from an elite, loyal military cohort into a badly paid, independent, and unruly interest group that on occasion even deposed sultans. By the 18th century, their defense of their privileges posed a far greater threat to the empire's own inhabitants than the Corps did to its enemies. They were feared by their Christian neighbors, whom they attacked with impunity in the streets, by their fellow Muslims, and by the Porte itself. After the defeat of Napoleon and the rise of the breakaway Mehmet Ali in Egypt, the Central Ottoman state reasserted its authority in a bid to modernize its military and restore its own prestige. In 1826, the Janissary Corps in the capital was massacred and replaced by a professional army. Shortly afterward, British pressure compelled the port to liberalize trade and to promise equality before the law for all subjects of the empire. In the 1850s, it finally became possible, at least in theory, to buy and sell land. A change not very much later, it should be noted, than that occurring in the Hungarian countryside. All this meant a weakening of the old intrusive regulatory imperial economy and permitted the expansion of commercial agriculture, cotton and tobacco, Serbian pigs and Romanian wheat, within an international market. Foreign capital, goods, and investors followed. Most peasants remained self-sufficient and mistrustful of money, with good reason, since they were probably worse off for capitalism's triumph. They faced now a centralized imperial state that was trying to collect taxes more efficiently, giving more legal power to landlords and whittling away customary peasant rights to land and produce. Capitalism was forcing change upon the Ottoman Empire, the most threatening solvent of that sense of customary fairness that underpinned the Balkan peasantry's sense of the natural order. Over time, this led peasants toward what Stoyanovich concisely describes as a strategy of demanding the abolition both of the landlords and of the state that refused to abolish the landlords. Capitalism, in other words, and the modernization of the Ottoman state had political consequences. In the Turkish Empire, as in Austria-Hungary and Tsarist Russia, the coming of a money economy and the modern state disrupted older patterns of social relations and helped pave the way for political changes as well. Only in the light of this dramatic economic and societal disruption can one understand the emergence of mass nationalism in the 19th century Balkans. Nationalism as a mass movement inevitably involved the peasants. Yet for them what counted was not the nation or other abstract political concepts, but their rights to land, livelihood, and fair taxes. As farming was monetized and traditional dues were replaced by cash obligations, class tensions increased in the countryside. The 1875 Herzegovina Revolt, which triggered off a major collapse of Ottoman power in the Balkans, was provoked by harvest failure and the subsequent maltreatment of peasants by soldiers accompanying the tax farmers. It began, wrote the French consul in Sarajevo, with protests of subjects of all religions against excessive tax demands. Another eyewitness was even clearer. It is mainly an agrarian war. In its origin, agrarian rather than political. Class antagonism and nationalism emerged together. The peasants were basically right. Political independence favored them by creating conditions of relative tranquility and security of property. Independence ended neither population pressure on land nor brigandage. Indeed, both persisted for decades into the life of independent Greece, Montenegro, and Serbia, often to the public embarrassment of the new state's leaders. But it did increase the overall security of the Christian majority, with immediate results. In 1841, Adolphe Blanqui had correctly predicted that, when Bulgaria enjoys a regime of security, the immense regions which today are left to the ravages of goats and poor pasturage will be put under cultivation. Crossing from the Ottoman lands into semi-independent Serbia in 1853, one traveler, who was not unsympathetic to the Turks, was struck that we seemed to enter a new clime. The whole valley teemed with luxuriant crops. The road had been formed with care, and everything betokened industry and comfort, the result of security. As a result, after independence, hill dwellers descended again into the plains. Population grew quickly, and soon the margin of uncultivated land shrank. The newly enfranchised peasantry, possessed as if by an insatiable desire for land, now cut back the ancient forests and extended their own holdings. During the last decade, a frightful extent of woodland has been cleared, wrote a German visitor to Romania in 1900. The great forests of the Serbian Šumadija disappeared in a few decades. The shepherding economy, which had flourished for the past 300 years, was plunged into crisis, as pasture came under cultivation, and governments carved up landed estates and distributed them to peasant smallholders. The Balkan land reforms of the 1920s, followed by a second wave after 1945, in those countries ruled by communist parties, parceled up large tracts of land among the farmers of cash crops, and deprived sheep of their traditional winter grazing grounds. New political borders severed summer from winter grazing. The transhuman shepherds became a vanishing breed, rare already in the 1950s, and today all but extinct. Before 1922, it was not exceptional for a man to own 2,000 sheep, wrote a British anthropologist in 1964. Today, a flock of 500 is considerable. Thus, independence brought new difficulties to those who worked the land. Land is becoming a commodity, noted a Croatian scholar of peasant life in 1935. Peasants were inexorably and often reluctantly drawn into the cash nexus, but on terms that left them less and less equipped to avoid debt. They parceled out holdings among their heirs, so that within a few generations, farmland was hopelessly fragmented and inefficient. High population growth accelerated this creation of a pattern of tiny, unviable plots. To make matters worse, the old patterns of collective farming, especially strong among the Slavs, began to disappear. The zadruga broke up as each family set up on its own. Atomization made the farmer less self-reliant and more dependent on farming for money. But there were few crops that allowed a peasant family any measure of prosperity for more than a generation or two. Those products, like tobacco or currants, Serbian plums and pigs, grown for export, were exposed to the whims of the international market. In independent Romania, which had become one of the world's chief exporters of grain at the turn of the century, social tensions in the countryside, between the miserably impoverished peasant sharecroppers and the often Jewish merchants who leased the Moldavian estates, exploded in a peasant revolt in 1907. The worst peasant uprising in modern Balkan history was suppressed by the Romanian army, only at the cost of an estimated 11,000 lives. Romania had the least equal pattern of landholding in the Balkans. 1% of landowners held nearly 50% of the arable and grazing lands, while perhaps 85% of peasant cultivators were operating at or below subsistence levels. But the pressure of high reproduction rates and the fragmentation of landholdings was impoverishing other Balkan farming populations too. Mass emigration, especially overseas, demonstrated how hard the newly independent states were finding it to make peasant farming work. The portraits of Montenegrin, Croatian, Greek, and Romanian Jewish country folk stare down at visitors to the Ellis Island Museum in New York, testifying to the great wave of immigrants to America from the Balkans. Migration had begun to gather pace in the last decades of Ottoman rule, but continued thereafter. By 1912, 250,000 Greeks had left for the United States, nearly 10% of the population, and the largest proportion from any European state after 1900. Entire villages became dependent on remittances from overseas. Some areas started to suffer from labor shortages before the First World War. Then U.S. immigration restrictions cut off the outflow. In the 1950s, the same pattern would emerge as Greek and Yugoslav peasants again fled the land for Australia and Germany. The land simply could not support the highest reproduction rates in Europe. Peasants tried to resist the incursions of modernity. Their generosity and hospitality toward travelers, often codified into custom, existed alongside a deep suspicion of neighbors and the inhabitants of the next village, not to mention landlords. The hatred that existed between hill and valley was well known. "I'd rather marry a Turk than have to go around in black and wear a kerchief," was how sophisticated Dalmatian lowland girls mocked the Highland shepherds who came to market in the early 17th century. The plains were always held by someone alien to the mountaineers, who were hungry for bread and land, and tired of the bare, though beautiful crags that were their home, wrote the Montenegrin Milo van Gilas. In his memoirs, Gilas vividly conveys the mutual bitterness felt between peasant and townfolk. If the townspeople, erstwhile peasants, had contempt for the peasants, he writes, the peasants in turn hated them. The peasants looked down upon the townspeople as a sluggish, wily, and lying breed, who ate little and delicately, fancy soups, tripes, and pastries, and wasted away in damp, crowded little rooms. For centuries, the village had been the main political, administrative, fiscal, and military unit organizing the collective lives of rural inhabitants of the Balkans. It was the village which they referred to as their fatherland, and its representatives spoke for them before the dignitaries of the state and other intruders. In the 19th century, this isolated collectivity began to change in ways its inhabitants found hard to comprehend. Used to a world in which towns were centers of administration and trade, inhabited chiefly by Turks and foreign merchants and shopkeepers, peasants were inclined to identify themselves with the moral essence of national life. There are no members of the Serbian nation but peasants, pronounced Vuk Karadžić early in the 19th century. Money meant exploitation. Shops and commerce implied degeneration. Some peasants complained that young people were tempted to steal food from their homes to procure useless, cheap goods at the shop. But now they found that independence brought no escape from these evils. They had expelled the Turkish landlords and officials, only to find that a new governing class had taken their place, with new means of enrichment and new pretensions. In analyzing the national character, a young British diplomat commented on Fin de siècle Serbia, you have two distinct classes to deal with, the governmental and commercial, which wears coats, trousers and boots, but not always socks, and the peasant, which affects jackets, petticoats, and sandals. The arbitrary and corrupt Ottoman tax farmer had been superseded by a salaried and modernizing bureaucracy, eager to replace the old money anarchy with a single currency, to send out gendarmes, teachers, surveyors, and census takers to classify, register, and chart the land, and educate those who worked it. All this sounded like more interference and exploitation, not less. The modern Balkan state undoubtedly intruded further into the farmer's life than the Ottoman state had done. There were more civil servants per capita in the Balkans than in Germany or Britain. Better the Turkish bullet than the Greek pen, the expression I heard from one Macedonian peasant in the 1990s, was no doubt uttered by many of his forebears in the age of Balkan independence. Yet with only limited success in articulating their grievances in the new parliaments, there was little the peasants could do about this. Politically, their inability to organize cost them dear. Despite their overwhelming numbers, they remained politically negligible. Other parties co-opted them through networks of clientelism, while the state used the gendarme, the schoolteacher, and tax collector to keep an eye on the villages. Independence, therefore, turned out to be the Balkan peasantry's final victory. Land reforms in the 1920s, which were a peasant success of sorts, reflected fears among Balkan politicians that without buying off the peasants, they might not be able to prevent revolutionary Bolshevism from subverting society. Yet land reform alone did not guarantee peasants a living. On the contrary, the outcome by the 1930s was greater fragmentation of holdings and an even less efficient pattern of land tenure than before. The peasants' political triumph led to his economic ruin. Flight from the land was inexorable, hindered only by muddy roads and the lack of prospects elsewhere. The deeper problem was that peasant values offered no solution to the demographic and economic dilemmas facing the new Balkan states. Small holdings simply did not create enough wealth, even in good times, to satisfy a newly consumerist society. Villages lacked cinemas, phonographs, and the other amusements that dazzled the minds of young people. In the 1930s, Croatian peasant girls chatted glibly about makeup, of patent leather shoes and high heels. They told the visitor that they preferred finer clothes to better food on the grounds, that no one can see what I've got inside me, but all can tell what I've got on. However, economic depression allowed them neither new clothes nor sufficient food. Between the wars, almost all crops went down in price and plunged peasants into debt. Interwar economists calculated that 6 to 8 million of a rural labor force of just under 30 million had no real work, thanks to what one described as the vicious circle of population pressure, poverty, and lack of industries. To some extent, the war years allowed country dwellers to gain their revenge on townspeople. For a brief period in the 1940s, to be a producer of food was to be master once more. But when peace returned, the locus of political action and wealth creation reverted to the cities. In 1974, the historian Stephen Runciman bemoaned the modern Balkan megalopolis that had brought high-rise apartments, traffic jams, and atmospheric pollution to the small, sleepy capitals he had first visited half a century earlier. But the mountains no longer offered an option for communal life in the way they had done 2 centuries earlier, and there was no replacing the destroyed forests. Village populations in the Pindus Mountains dropped from thousands in the 19th century to a few hundred today. Except through tourism and remittances, there is no way these settlements can continue. The movement of peoples from the hills to the plains has been succeeded by a further movement into the towns. In 50 years, the total share of the working population employed on the land fell from 80% to 37% in Bulgaria, from 78% to 29% in Yugoslavia, and from 77% to 29% in Romania. In the Balkans, we are dealing no longer with a peasant society, but with its successor. 2. Before the nation. The ecclesiastic geography of these degraded regions must, of course, be only interesting to the mere antiquary, as it can throw no light on its history, and little even on its topography. John Pinkerton, Modern Geography, 1802.
No longer control an objective.
Our church is holy, but our priests are thieves. Byron's servant. At the beginning of the 20th century, Greek and Bulgarian patriots wrestled for the allegiance of the Orthodox Christian peasants of Ottoman Macedonia. It turned out to be unexpectedly difficult. On my arrival in Salonika, wrote one Greek activist, the idea of Greek peasants and the people on the actual difference between the Greek Orthodox Church and Bulgarian schismatics was rather shaky. I realized this because whenever I asked them what they were, Romaioi, that is Greeks, or Vulgaroi, Bulgarians, they stared at me incomprehendingly. Asking each other what my words meant, crossing themselves, they would answer me naively, "Well, we're Christians." "What do you mean, Romaioi, or Vulgaroi?" Similarly, the pro-Bulgarian Daniel, a town-made patriot of recent construction, as his English companion described him, was vexed with the villagers' apathy. Round the Prespa Lake, he tried to explain to them that by being forced to listen to the church service in Greek, rather than in their own Slavic tongue, they were being exploited by an anti-Bulgarian clergy. But they bolted raw cabbage and washed it down with mastic, and only said it did not matter. Many of them spoke Greek. The priest took a suck at the bottle and was of the same opinion. He spoke the local Slavic dialect himself for ordinary purposes, but he had learned all the services in Greek. It was a good service, and what did it matter? Daniel was very annoyed and told me that they were very ignorant. Really, they were all Bulgarians, and ought to have Bulgarian priests, but they did not know. Nor, as far as I could see, did they care here. This indifference to nationalist categories among the Sultan's Christian subjects reflected their sense of belonging to a community defined by religion, where the linguistic differences between Greek and Bulgarian mattered less than their shared belief in orthodoxy. Such encounters marked the moment when the bearers of the concept of modern ethnic politics infiltrated the countryside and encountered a pre-national world. The linguistic, racial, and religious diversity of the peoples inhabiting southeastern Europe dates back to the Slav invasions, if not earlier. Politically, however, this counted for little until recently. Neither the Byzantine nor the Ottoman empires were ethnically based polities. For centuries, conversion and acculturation opened up elite careers to men of different backgrounds. Because the history of the Balkans has mostly been written by descendants of the nationalist patriots described above, the hesitant, ambivalent voices of the peasants they were trying to enlighten rarely make it into the archives. But one can detect, even fairly recently, the persistence of habits of mind that predate the triumph of ethnic politics. I questioned some boys from a remote mountain village near Akrida, which had neither teacher nor resident priest, and where not a single inhabitant was able to read, in order to discover what amount of traditional knowledge they possessed, wrote H.N. Brailsford in 1905. I took them up to the ruins of the Bulgarian Tsar's fortress, which dominates the lake and the plain from the summit of an abrupt and curiously rounded hill. "Who built this place?" I asked them. The answer was significant. "The freemen." "And who were they?" "Our grandfathers." "Yes, but were they Serbs, or Bulgarians, or Greeks, or Turks?" "They weren't Turks, they were Christians." And this seemed to be about the measure of their knowledge. The question of whether they were Serbs, Bulgarians, or Greeks meant little for Christian peasant boys in the Ottoman system, just as Muslims, too, attached relatively little importance to their ethnic background. Hitherto, there has never been any separatist movement, either national or doctrinal, inside Islam, noted a British diplomat in 1912, surprised by the novelty of an Albanian nationalist organization. All Muslimans, whether Shia or Sunni, Turk, Arab or Kurd, are simply entered on the register as Muslims. The consciousness of most of the Sultan's subjects was shaped neither by school nor by the army, the two key institutions through which the modern state propagates national identities. The Ottoman state had treated them on the basis of religion, not language. Thus, they had not had to encounter such novel forms of classification as were implied by Brailsford's questions, though their grandchildren would take them for granted. One need not look back far into history to see the way in which human migrations have shaped the ethnography of the Balkans. In the 20th century alone, millions of people have moved, or been moved, from one country to another. In the post-war period, Greek and Yugoslav workers settled in Australia, the United States, and Western Europe, looking for jobs. In the 1990s, new movements of peoples looking for work or fleeing war formed the latest chapter in a story that has been going on for millennia. Yet despite this constant ebb and flow, the basic ethnographic composition of the peninsula was established as long ago as the 7th century A.D. Life in the Roman provinces south of the Danube had been disrupted before then by the incursions and raids of Germanic tribes and the Huns. But these invasions, though frequent and often destructive, were brief and usually ended with the raiders moving off elsewhere. The impact of the Slavic tribes was very different. Over roughly 200 years, they settled permanently in large numbers to till the land and graze their flocks across the peninsula as far south as the Peloponnese. Their arrival in the Balkans marked the end of the ancient world and had the momentous effect of driving a wedge between the western and eastern halves of the Roman Empire that would eventually contribute to the split between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. The area's existing inhabitants competed for land and power with the newcomers. In Albania, they found refuge in the mountains, preserving their distinct language amid what became a largely Slavic-speaking zone of settlement. The Greeks, who described themselves as Romaioi, inhabitants of the Roman Empire, in place of the older Hellenes, a term that had come to mean pagan, were penned into isolated areas, islands, or into walled towns and depopulated cities, where they preserved the Greco-Roman civic culture of the empire. The Turkic Bulgars, who ruled over Slavic tribes in their Khanate around the lower Danube, ended up, much like ruling elites in England, Normandy, and Varangian Rus, adopting the language of the peoples they ruled. Right up to the early 20th century, the basic pattern of Slavic-speaking village and Greek-speaking town was preserved in Macedonia. Initially, the linguistic divide between Greeks and Slavs was also a religious one, between Christians and pagans. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Slavs were converted to Christianity, as the Greeks had been before them. Cyril and Methodius, the two brothers who undertook this mission, were from Salonika, where they had undoubtedly come into contact with the Slavic language spoken by local peasants. By developing an alphabet and a liturgy in Slavonic, they and their successors brought the Slavs under the sway of the Church, at a time when much of Eastern and Northern Europe remained faithful to older gods. The price to be paid for this success was the sacrifice by the Church of the privileged position of the Greek language in the emergent Orthodox Balkan Commonwealth, an attitude that contrasted with the papacy's growing insistence upon Latin. Many languages, one church, was the secret of Byzantine Orthodoxy. The Balkans were too mountainous, too vulnerable and fragmented to make for an easy religious or linguistic homogenization. It was not only the Albanians who sought the protection of the hills. The Vlachs were a shepherding people who preserved their Romance language right up to this century, amid Greek and Slav-speaking majorities. The Sarakatsani were another even smaller nomadic group. Orthodoxy predominated, but did not prevail everywhere. The kings of Croatia followed the Latin Rite and Catholicism, despite their Slavic background, while in Bosnia, a third Bosnian church spread before disappearing with the arrival of the Turks. A Bulgarian Tsar was crowned by the Pope in 1204, while Catholic and later Protestant missionaries devoted their energies, though with little reward outside Albania and the Aegean Islands, to proselytizing for the true faith. Small Jewish communities, too, existed throughout the peninsula. Greek as the ruling language during the Byzantine period, and as the language of the Gospels, Christian culture, and classical learning, through Ottoman times as well, attracted ambitious young Vlach or Slav men, just as Venetian, German, and later French would do as well. As late as the 1860s, according to the memoirs of one Ottoman official, Greek was still known to all Romanians of distinction, and used in preference to Turkish when Ottoman and Romanian notables met. Jewish communities that dated back to classical times acquired Greek as their vernacular tongue. Western Europeans, too, could turn into Greeks. In 1833, several hundred Bavarian mercenaries accompanied King Otto to Athens. A century later, SS officials, scouring Europe for precious German blood, found their great-grandchildren living on farms in Attica. Most had forgotten German and become Greek-speaking and Orthodox. Of course, Hellenization had its limits. North of the old Via Egnatia, Greek made few inroads among the Slavic-speaking villages. In northern Albania and the Danubian provinces, too, its use remained confined to higher church clergy, and, in the latter case, to the courts of native princes. Even within what would later become Greece, many peasants spoke Albanian until the 1950s. But in general, knowledge of Greek remained the main path to learning, religious authority, and political power for as long as the Byzantine Empire existed. The dominion of Greek culture over Balkan Christians was not ended by the collapse of Byzantium between the 13th and 15th centuries, but it was transformed through the arrival of a new people, Turkish-speaking, Muslim by religion. These Turks defeated the various Christian powers of southeastern Europe. Not only the rulers of Byzantium, but also Serb, Genoese, Hungarian, Venetian, and other dynasties, and in doing so, unified the region politically and economically in an empire that lasted for 5 centuries. Before their conquest of the Balkans, the Turks had been active in the region as allies and auxiliaries of the very Christian powers that they later ended up subjugating. After it, they continued to use Christian soldiers, notably in their military campaigns in Anatolia and the Middle East. Christian-Muslim relations were thus based on generations of interaction, and conquest and collaboration more closely resembled patterns evident in the British takeover of India than in the German invasion of Poland. Even before the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Christians were turning to Islam for many reasons. A 15th century Greek archbishop noted with disgust the voluntary conversion of those who were motivated by the desire to win silver, become notables, and live in luxury. By the early 16th century, several 100,000 had probably converted. Members of the Bosnian and Byzantine nobility, including some of the imperial Paleolog family itself, served the Sultan loyally in high positions, both as Christians and increasingly as Muslim converts. When the Ottoman Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha Angelovich negotiated in 1457 with the Grand Voivode of the Serbian court, Michael Angelovich, he was in fact dealing with his own half-brother. And later it was with his cousin, the Byzantine philosopher George Amiroutsis, that Mahmud Pasha negotiated the surrender of the Byzantine province of Trebizond. The Christian Amiroutsis subsequently found refuge at the Ottoman court and was favored by the Sultan. His 2 sons converted to Islam and became high court officials. The well-connected Mahmud Pasha was himself of Serbian and Byzantine descent. Other Grand Viziers of Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople in 1453, were Greeks or Albanians by birth. Many of these men were children from aristocratic Christian families trained at the imperial court. Others were recruited from low-born peasantry through the child tax levied on Balkan Christian communities. Until the early 17th century, the Ottoman court relied on its slave recruits. Most of the inhabitants of the land of Rum are of mixed origin, wrote Mustafa Ali in the 17th century. Amongst the more prominent, there are few whose genealogies do not go back to a convert to Islam, or whose ethnic origins, either on their mother's or father's side, do not go back to a filthy infidel, despite the fact that they themselves have grown up as upright and outstanding Muslims. The imperial governing elite was admired throughout Europe for its meritocratic character. And observers noted with surprise that the most senior officials often came from families of humble birth. There was no Ottoman hereditary aristocracy. No nobility of blood, commented George Sand in 1610, and few Turks, generally a term of reproach. Indeed, the characterization of the Ottoman system as Turkish was very wide of the mark. As late as the 19th century, it was noted that no Mussulman ever calls himself a Turk. Further, to call him so is to insult him. The term was used to refer to Anatolian peasants. So prominent was the presence of converts at the port that for a time, Slavic rivaled Turkish as a court language. The better sort used the Slavonian tongue, observed William Lithgow. The vulgar speak the Turkish language, which being originally the Tartarian speech, they borrow from the Persian their words of state, from the Arabic their words of religion, from the Grecians their terms of war, and from the Italian their words and titles of navigation. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu noted that in the capital they speak Turkish, Greek, Hebrew, Armenian, Arabic, Persian, Russian, Sclavonian, Wallachian, German, Dutch, French, English, Italian, Hungarian. And what is worse, there is 10 of these languages spoke in my own family. If conversion was the prerequisite for individual advancement and a career in government, Islamicization on a mass scale was observable only in a few areas of the Balkans. In Thrace and Macedonia, the first provinces conquered by the Ottomans, villagers from Anatolia were resettled among the Christian inhabitants. But imperial resettlement was not the most important force for Islamicization. In Bosnia, in parts of Bulgaria, and later in Cyprus, Albania, and Crete, Christian peasants converted in substantial numbers, and often en masse. From Bulgaria, we read that all the unbelievers in a village have converted to Islam. All the inhabitants of a big village of unbelievers have gradually converted to Islam. Begins another Ottoman fatwa, decreeing the building of a new mosque to serve the community. More than 40,000 people abandoned Christianity. The Bishop of Zagreb wrote in alarm in November 1536. More and more people are doing so, hoping they will enjoy more peaceful times in what remains of their lives. Mass conversion continued into the late Ottoman period. In Albania, Christians adopted Islam in the 18th century. Around the Drina Valley, a traveler in the middle of the 19th century observed that the mostly Roman Catholic villagers have been so persecuted of late years that a large number have become Mussulmans. A compelling argument for conversion was the second-class status of non-Muslims in the Ottoman world. Christians and Jews were tolerated as people of the book, but they faced discrimination and ill treatment on the grounds of their religion. They were not allowed to ride horses, wear the color green, or build churches above a certain height. Their word counted for less than that of a Muslim in Ottoman courts, and they bore heavier taxes, supposedly for not performing military service. Despite these hardships, however, the Balkans retained their predominantly Christian and non-Turkish speaking character. This stood in sharp contrast to the Ottoman domains in Anatolia, where Turkish and Islam came to prevail over the long centuries from the Seljuk domination onward. In Ottoman Europe, the vast bulk of the population, probably around 80%, remained Christian. Even where Islam made inroads into the countryside, it rarely carried the Turkish language along with it. Bosnian Muslims still spoke their native Slavic. The Muslim Ali Pasha of Yanina spoke Albanian and Greek, but not Turkish. The Muslim peasants of Crete spoke Greek and enjoyed the Erotokritos, the island's epic poem, as much as the Christians, from whom, after all, most of them were descended. Outside the original heartlands around Edirne, the Turkish language in the Balkans remained an administrative lingua franca, confined to urban centers. Cities like Bosna Sarai, Skopje, and Sofia were heavily Islamic, and Turkish-speaking islands of imperial governance in a mostly Christian sea, much as German-speaking cities functioned in Slavic Eastern Europe at the same time. If the Balkans did not become another Islamic land, one reason was that the sultans had no interest in making this happen. Christians paid higher taxes, and mass conversion would have impoverished the empire. Very many Greeks, reported 17th century travelers, unable to bear any longer this cruel tyranny, wish to turn Turk. But many are rejected because, say their lords, in receiving them into the Muslim faith, their tribute would be so much reduced. Less material factors also played a part. On the two occasions, in 1517 and again in 1647, when the Porte seriously considered the forced Islamicization of the Balkan Christians, there was religious opposition to the idea on Quranic grounds. In general, there was no Muslim analog to the widespread Christian impulse to drive out the infidel and the heretic. On the contrary, Islamic law prescribed the toleration of Christian and Jewish communities of believers. It prohibited Muslims from converting to other religions, but did not insist upon conversion in the other direction. Indeed, many a convert was obliged to demonstrate that the desire to embrace the true faith was not prompted by materialistic or ignoble motives. For orthodoxy, therefore, Islamic rule was far less damaging than Roman Catholic. Catholic armies had brought destruction to Balkan Christians in the Crusades of 1204 and 1444. Venetian rule had been harsh and repressive in Crete and the Peloponnese. After the brief occupation of Chios by the Venetians in 1694, islanders said they were better off under the Turks. "I'd rather turn Turk than join you Latins who hate and persecute us," an Orthodox monk told a Catholic missionary in 1641. In fact, Orthodox Catholic relations were often more harmonious inside the empire than outside. In the 17th century Cyclades, for instance, where there was a small Catholic population, Catholics and Orthodox islanders often attended each other's services and built adjacent churches. As late as 1749, the Orthodox Patriarchate reprimanded the folk of Sifnos and Mykonos for failing to recognize any difference between the two rites. But on the whole, few peasants converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism, despite the activity of Jesuits and other missionaries across the Balkans. Turkish rule tilted the balance of power between Patriarchate and Papacy in favor of the former, not least because the Patriarchate, unlike the Papacy, was a servant of the Porte. In the middle of the 18th century, a dispute over appointments in Antioch suddenly brought home to the Patriarch the dangers of too relaxed an attitude toward Catholic activity in the empire. It was at this point that, in parallel with the Porte's own efforts at administrative reform, the ecumenical Patriarchate tightened its control over the community of believers, laying the basis for that system of centralized ecclesiastical rule, which would come to be known as the Millet system. In looser fashion, however, the Orthodox Church had been brought into the system of Ottoman government much earlier, at least from the time when Sultan Mehmet II established new guidelines for the administration of his Christian flock, Re'aya. Christians, like Jews, were recognized as zimmi, a protected people, permitted to govern themselves according to their own customs, provided that they remained loyal and paid their taxes. The Orthodox patriarchs, preeminent among them the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, were guarantors on both counts, and over time came to be regarded as the heads of the groups of the infidel. In return, they received the authority to tax the Orthodox flock for communal purposes and to administer justice to Christians through church courts. Their representatives enjoyed official privileges, such as the use of Turkish soldiers to accompany them when collecting taxes. The Sultan thus handed the church hierarchy a new role. In addition to the spiritual functions it had carried out in the Byzantine world, he was now gradually drawn into politics and administration as a voice for the empire's Orthodox subjects. In this way, the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans, far from crushing Christian orthodoxy, brought it many advantages, as both the Patriarchate and its enemies and rivals realized. After the chaos of the final fragmented phase of Byzantine rule, the Church was now able to recover, indeed expand its power, both in the Balkans and in Anatolia. Thanks to the Turks, it was largely freed from the threat of Catholicism presented by the Venetians and the Genoese in the eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman power, in effect, unified the Balkans for the first time in centuries. In the late 16th century, it was reported from the Ottoman capital that the Christians there do not want any other domination in preference to the Turks. And when Turkish troops reconquered the Peloponnese from the Venetians in 1715, the Greek peasants welcomed and supported them. Ottoman rule was bringing Balkan Christians not only religious autonomy, but increasing prosperity as well. Right from the start, Christian control of some revenue collecting allowed a few individuals to amass extraordinary wealth. In the 15th century, Michael Cantacuzzinos, a maker and breaker of patriarchs, was said to consort with pashas and viziers, and to be addressed by them in terms of respect. Later, Orthodox merchants took advantage of the collapse of old trading rivals like Venice and the opening up of new markets in Central Europe during the 18th century, turned Bucharest and Iași into centers of Hellenic learning and culture, a crucial intersection of Ottoman, Russian, Italian, and Central European influences. Greek Christians by birth, Ottoman by allegiance, and through self-interest, the Phanariots were, in the refined and ambiguous words of one of their most illustrious figures, as Greek as it is possible to be. Being Greek for them meant prestige, wealth, and glory in the imperial service of the Sultan. We conform to the prescription of the gospel. Render unto Caesars the things which are Caesar's. Alexandros Mavrocordatos wrote. It is not the custom of us Christians to confuse what is temporary and corruptible with what is divine and eternal. When it came to corruption, the Phanariots had experience. Their rise coincided with growing financial and ethical problems inside the Patriarchate. In the century after 1495, there were just 19 changes of patriarch. The following century, there were 61. The church became notoriously corrupt, as its highest offices were bought and sold through huge bribes to Ottoman officials. The money, often borrowed by candidates for office from wealthy Phanariots, could be recouped only through the church's taxation of Christian peasants. Growing centralization under the ecumenical patriarch increased the resources at stake and probably made the problem worse. A saying common among the Greek peasants, according to a British traveler, was that the country labors under three curses: the priests, the Kogia Bashis, local Christian notables, and the Turks, always placing the plagues in this order. In 19th century Bosnia, the Greek patriarch takes good care that these eparchies shall be filled by none but Phanariots. And thus it happens that the Orthodox Christians of Bosnia, who form the majority of the population, are subject to ecclesiastics alien in blood, in language, in sympathies, who oppress them hand in hand with the Turkish officials and set them, often, an even worse example of moral depravity. The reason was clear. They have to send enormous bribes yearly to the fountainhead. This story of extortion and corruption spelled the end of the old Orthodox ecumenism, created bitterness between the church and its flock, and, where the peasants were not Greek speakers, provoked a sense of their exploitation by the Greek church that paved the way for Balkan nationalism. Yet even while corruption was eating into the institutions of the church, there flourished a world of Balkan orthodoxy, whose horizons stretched from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, from northern Italy to Russia. The freedom of movement and thought possible for educated and mobile Christians in this Orthodox Balkan Commonwealth can be traced in the careers and travels of men such as Yosipos Mosiodax, a distinguished pedagogue and scholar, who was by origin of Vlach from the southern bank of the Danube in present-day Romania. Born in 1725, he was educated and Hellenized at schools in Salonika, Smyrna, and Mount Athos, before studying at Padua, and then teaching at the princely academies of Iași and Bucharest, the centers of Greek learning in the Balkans. Having also traveled to Venice, Vienna, and Budapest, he claimed to have seen all the diasporas of the Greeks. His contemporary, Constantine da Pontes, was born on the island of Skopelos, educated in Constantinople, and traveled widely in Ottoman lands. In 1757, da Pontes began an 8-year journey across the Balkans, carrying the true cross of his monastery. He sailed from Athos and crossed future Bulgarian lands to reach the Danube and Moldavia before returning south to Constantinople, thereby saving the city from a plague, according to his own account, which was raging elsewhere. and returning in triumph to the Holy Mountain in 1765. Da Pontes's peregrinations took place in a world in which his homeland was his native island. The term Greece had no political or territorial meaning for him. Southeastern Europe was a region marked out not by nation-states, but by the symbols of orthodoxy. Time was measured by the rhythms of the Eastern Church, rather than by any secular sense of history. The divine and the supernatural were omnipresent in daily life. Yet Balkan orthodoxy also had its material rewards. Sweet wines from Samos in Cyprus, pistachios from Aleppo, figs from Smyrna, apples from Moldavia, and Wallachian cheeses. When the historian Christopher Dawson asked why it was that the Byzantine Empire, unlike the papacy in the West, failed to consolidate its cultural religious hold in its part of Europe, he missed the point that a Byzantine culture did continue to evolve under the guidance of orthodoxy and Ottoman imperial rule. It evolved in the stilted writings of the Greek phanariots of the Sultan's capital, who oscillated between fidelity to the Porte and hopes for a rebirth of the Byzantine Empire, but who remained throughout pious supporters of orthodoxy and Hellenism. And it evolved in the hands of a church intellectual like Eugenios Vulgaris, perhaps the most important figure of late 18th century orthodoxy, who was educated in his native Corfu, under Venetian rule, in Turkish Yanina, and at the University of Padua, before bringing his teachings to Athos, Constantinople, and eventually to the Russia of Catherine the Great, to whom he preached the dangers of a new Catholic advance into Eastern Europe. Separate but parallel religious institutions were fundamental to the Ottoman governing machine. The Sultan's subjects were divided into communities on the basis of belief and ruled largely by their own ecclesiastical hierarchy, with rabbis, bishops, and qadis presiding over courts, supervising civil affairs, and assuming responsibility for collecting taxes from their own flock, as well as other economic matters. But while religion thus acted to demarcate communities and individuals from one another, and even to divide them, it also constituted a shared outlook upon life's problems and dilemmas. This was especially true under a system of rule that, compared with those current elsewhere in Europe, offered an unparalleled degree of religious tolerance, there being a free liberty of conscience for all kinds of religion, through all his dominions, in Lithgow's words. Religious power was a common resource that was feared, respected, and consulted by peoples of all faiths. Christians availed themselves of Muslim wisdom, gathering charms or holy ground from mosques or tekkes, holy shrines. In the legend of one Christian martyr, we also read how a Muslim woman was cured by the patriarch. Having initially refused to see her, on the grounds that it is not proper for us to accept those who are foreign to our faith, the patriarch relented, saying, "Him that cometh to me will I in no wise cast out." And just as Muslims visited Christian priests, so too they visited Jewish rabbis. We read, for example, of a 16th century Istanbul man who vowed, in the midst of a dangerous fever, that if he recovered, he would give up his taste in young boys. Cured, he thought better of it, but hesitated to break his vow. Having been advised by the ulema of Istanbul that he could not wriggle out of an oath once made, he sought the advice of the rabbis of Salonika to see if they could find a loophole. They suggested he try women. People who faced special dangers, such as seafarers, often displayed an ecumenical piety. When the Turks' preparations for a voyage have been made, noted de Buspech, they come to the Greeks and ask whether the waters have been blessed. And if they say that they have not been blessed, they put off their sailing. But if they are told that the ceremony has been performed, they embark and set sail. Sailors of all faiths, especially pirates and corsairs, revered icons of the Virgin Mary. Caught in a storm, a Frenchman was urged by a Turkish sailor to pray for the Virgin's help, since he had heard, while a captive in Vienna, that her intercession was helpful. In this world, one needed help from whatever quarter. Impiety was far more grievous than belonging to a different faith. An English slave on a Turkish warship recounted how, at their first coming on board, they had